And now it's Deborah Kobylt Live.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today on Deborah Kobylt Live. And please welcome Mallary Tenore Tarpley. She is a journalist, also a professor, journalism professor over at the University of Texas, Austin. And she wrote this very powerful book based on her life story, and it's called Slip: Life in the Middle of Eating Disorder Recovery. It is a really raw book. It is an incredible uh, journey of Mallary dealing with eating disorder. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, I think the best place to start is your story and dialing it back to when you first discovered you had an eating disorder and how you believe you slipped into this. And the the title "Slip" is very powerful. We'll get into that later as well. So please, let's hear about your story, Mallory.
Sure. So, my story really dates back to childhood. When I was 11 years old, I lost my mother to metastatic breast cancer. And at the time, I did not know how to deal with this loss. And I thought that grief was something you were supposed to just get over in a day. And so the only way I knew how to cope was to pretend that I was okay. So I went to school the day after she died. I
Oh,
wrote the eulogy for her funeral and I didn't cry. And at the time, I was praised as being quite resilient and
right.
strong. And yet inside, I was falling apart and I felt so sad and just felt so angry, but I didn't know what to do with those emotions. And the more time passed, the farther away I felt from my mother. And I found that I wanted to stop time and I wanted to stay small and safe. And around the same
Wow.
time, yeah, I was taking a health class in the seventh grade and learning about quote unquote good foods and bad foods, and learning that I could change the way my body looked based on what I put into it. And so I began to think that maybe if I stayed the same size I was when my mom was alive, I could somehow be closer to her. So I began restricting my food intake, and it was really this warped form of time travel. And certainly didn't go into it thinking I'm going to develop an eating disorder, but that is what ended up happening. Within six
Wow.
months, I had developed anorexia. Didn't really know what it was at the time because I didn't have the words to describe what it was I was struggling with, but ended up getting hospitalized at age 13 and then received an official diagnosis and spent most of my teenage years in and out of treatment for the eating disorder. Got to a place where I felt like I was in full recovery, although I didn't know what full recovery meant. And so
Right.
I went back to school my junior year and really tried to achieve this perfectionistic full recovery. And I was petrified of making one wrong move because I thought that if I faltered, I would fail and I would slide back into dangerous territory. So I didn't think that there was any space between acute sickness and full recovery. And the pressure of all of that was so surmountable that in college, freshman year, I ended up relapsing and fell into this very vicious cycle of binge eating and restricting, which lasted for about 10 years.
Oh,
Yes. And it wasn't until my late 20s that I really began to think about how I could reframe my thinking around recovery and not look at every single slip as grounds for failure. It used to be that if I slipped, like if I ate a pint of ice cream, I'd think, well, I've got to keep going. I might as well just eat the bag of chips and the sleeve of cookies, and I would just spiral. And I said, what would it mean if I looked at slips as opportunities for growth and as ways to move forward, as opposed to just thinking that every slip has to turn into a slide? So I began to reframe my thinking around what I call the middle place, which is this name I've given to this gray space between acute sickness and full recovery. And it's a space we don't talk about in the eating disorder field. And I thought I was the only one in this place for a long time, but I ended up surveying and interviewing hundreds of people for my book, Slip, and found that this space is quite populous. And so I wanted to write a book that really talked about what does it mean to be in this middle place where you're better, but not all better? And what does it mean to live knowing that the disorder remains a vulnerability? So those are questions that I really delve into in the book.
it's absolutely incredible. I want to dial it back a little bit to when you were younger, your dad having to deal with all of this and reading that. in your book, my heart just skipped a beat. And you're a parent, you have two young children, ages 7 and 9. And for any parent out there, you were young, you were 11, 12 years old when dad had to deal with this. What was it like for him? And by the way, you spent many times in and out of Children's Hospital in Boston, correct? I mean, here he loses his wife. His daughter he doesn't quite know how to handle it. Let's describe from his point of view as a parent what that was like.
It was incredibly difficult because my father really didn't know what it was I was struggling with. All he knew
Right.
was that I was not eating and I wasn't enjoying food in the ways that I once had. And he saw that I was losing weight, but he didn't think I had an eating disorder because his only point of reference for an eating disorder was the death of singer songwriter Karen Carpenter, who had died due to complications from anorexia in 1983. And so my father thought that eating disorders only affected adults. So he did
Oh,
not believe that I was struggling with an eating disorder. And that also is just stemming from the fact that eating disorders are often misunderstood and they're hard to really understand because they can be so enigmatic. And that really played out for my father because so often he would ask me, why can't you just eat? Right. And that question came from a place of love, but also frustration and confusion. And he tried to take me to the doctor. He took me to the pediatrician on two separate occasions. But the pediatrician essentially told us that my weight loss was a passing phase, which was something that was really hard to grapple with because we knew that it was more than a phase, but we just didn't know what it was. And it turns out that that doctor did not know anything about eating disorders. And that is reflective of a larger systemic issue, which I would learn years later. And that is that the average doctor receives 0 to 2 hours of training on eating disorders. So there's not a lot known about them.
wow.
Yes, it's wild. And so for my father, it was really a matter of trying to figure out, how do I get my daughter care? He ended up talking to a friend who's a nurse, and she took one look at me and said, I think Mallory has an eating disorder, and I would recommend you
Oof.
take her to Boston Children's Hospital. So he took me, and essentially they admitted me to the emergency room that same night and officially gave me the anorexia diagnosis. And although that was hard, it at least gave my father and I some clarity around what I was struggling with.
How did you feel though? You're a young person, you're entering puberty. Kids are supposed to be, having fun, enjoying themselves. And here you are getting diagnosed with an eating disorder in and out of hospitals. What did that feel like for you?
It felt so challenging because I didn't think I could really explain the eating disorder to other peers. And it didn't seem like people really understood why I kept having to go in and out of the hospital. So
Mm,
many people would look at me and see that I had gained weight in the hospital and would assume that I was better. And yet, just because the number on the scale was higher didn't mean that the eating disorder had gone away. I was
right.
still very much grappling with disordered thoughts around my food and body. And often those disordered thoughts would then very quickly lead to disordered behaviors once I would leave the hospital. So I was very much in this revolving door of being in and out of treatment. And yet it got to the point where I was missing so many months of school because I was in treatment, but I almost didn't care, which was so sad
Wow.
thinking back on it because I was always a straight A student, always super hardworking and overachieving. And yet the eating disorder just took over so much of my identity to the point where I just stopped caring about anything else besides being the perfect anorexic. And I remember looking back at my old journals from that time, and there was a line where I essentially said, I want to be the sickest, most perfect anorexic. And I thought, oh my gosh, looking back on that now, it's so heartbreaking, but that's the mindset that I was in. So I really lost a lot of my identity and who I was during that period.
What does anorexia look like? Is it simply that you're eating nothing? Or because we know that it's different than binge eating, right? Obviously. But do you truly eat nothing? Are you just drinking water? What is it? What was it like for you?
I'm so glad you asked that because I was under that impression as a child that people with anorexia just don't eat anything. And a lot of people believe that, and it's
Right.
understandable. And so that was part of why I didn't think I had anorexia. But people with anorexia typically are still eating because they need to eat something in order to stay alive, essentially. But usually they're not eating much at all. So they're always in an energy deficit in that they are burning more calories than they're consuming. And so typically they're eating very minimal amounts of food. They're usually compensating in some way by obsessively exercising. They also have very distorted thoughts that are really taking up all of their mental space. So when I was sick, I couldn't really think about anything else besides counting calories and my weight and just trying to kind of be better at my disorder. So there's this mix of the physical side effects, but then also the mental effects. And of course, it can get to the point where anorexia can become deadly. We know that over 10,000 people each year will die due to complications from anorexia. So many people with this disorder are not eating nearly enough. The other thing I will say too is that we now know that there are people who struggle with anorexia who don't become clinically underweight. And so doctors refer to that as atypical anorexia. Although it's not all that atypical, it's quite common, but often those individuals get overlooked by the medical establishment, by family members and others, because they don't look the part of someone with an eating disorder and that they're not emaciated. But because of genetics or whatever reasons, their bodies just don't get to that point where they're clinically underweight.
What was it like for you being in and out of therapy, in terms of what did that look like, right? Each time you would relapse, like let's say you left therapy thinking, oh, I think I got it. Or did you? When you left, did you say to yourself, I don't really think I'm healed? Like what did that look like?
Yeah,
Chew, sorry.
oh, bless you.
Excuse me. Thank you. But go ahead. What did that look like? Like each time you left, were you thinking, I don't know if I should be leaving here. I don't feel right. Or did you say, I got it? And then you'd relapse. Like what was that like?
Yeah, it was so hard because every time I left the hospital, I felt like I wasn't ready. So
Mm.
I was on the medical unit twice at Boston Children's Hospital, and then I was on the psychiatric ward 3 times. And they had put
Mm.
me on the psychiatric ward because I was also struggling with a lot of comorbidities. So I had obsessive compulsive disorder and anxiety and depression. And so they thought that I needed a longer term stay. So very often I would be on that ward for 4 to 6 weeks at a time. And I never felt like I was ready to go home. I really liked
Mm.
the safety of the hospital because, in some ways, it almost gave me a permission slip to eat because I was being forced to eat and I felt like I had to. Whereas whenever I went home, I felt like I could very easily manipulate my dad and my family, and I could hide food. I could just get away with more, even though my father was so loving and caring. I knew that it was going to be much harder for me every time I came home. And so I would fall into this pattern of getting well in the hospital and getting at least to a weight that was safer for my body, but then only being able to work on the mental part of things a little bit and not enough to actually be in a place where I felt stable in my recovery. And so this is quite common among people with eating disorders where they rotate in and out, and it's known as the revolving door phenomenon. And it wasn't until I went to residential treatment for a year and a half when I really began to make meaningful progress in my recovery.
What did that look like? Like what is it that sort of clicked in your mind? And how old were you at the time?
So I entered residential treatment when I was 14. And this was after all of these different hospital stays. And it was a really difficult place to be because I was there with lots of other girls with various issues. I was actually the only individual with an eating disorder in the dorm that I lived in. So many of the other girls had been fire setters, they had dealt with substance abuse issues, suicide, lots of different mental health complications. And it was known as the place where you went when nothing else worked. 17 magazine had written an article about it and just talked about how it was the place of last resort for many individuals. I was one of the only girls in my dorm who actually had a family to go home to because many of the girls
Wow.
were wards of the state of Massachusetts. And so I had to work really meaningfully on recovery, and it took a long time. It was several months before I actually began to realize that I didn't want to live in a treatment facility like this for the rest of my life. And I started to recognize that I needed to make some changes. And a big part of my recovery was actually learning how to grieve the loss of my mother, because I
Mm.
needed to recognize that the eating disorder was not going to make me feel closer to my mother anymore, and that there were other ways of honoring her memory and of feeling close to her. And I was finally able to give myself permission to feel that sadness and that anger that I had for so long suppressed. And so that was a big part of recovery for me, as well as, of course, developing healthier habits around food and actually eating more variety of foods. I had gotten to the point where I was only eating the same foods every day. So I had to really shift the way I thought about food and also shift the way I thought about myself. So rather than identifying as the girl with anorexia, I began to think about all the other parts of my identity that I wanted to reconnect with. And I thought, well, I'm a writer, even though I'm only 16, and I am a daughter, and I am a student, and I'm a friend. And so being able to really think about who else I was apart from anorexia ended up being a big part of what helped me to move forward.
What is it that you eat now? Do you just sort of have a varied plate of food in front of you? Do you sometimes think, I don't want this? And then do you recognize what could be happening if you're starting to slip, if you will?
Yeah, so I know this about myself, that I still do have a tendency to restrict my food intake. I mean, if I'm stressed with work or something big has happened, my first inclination is to not want to eat. And I can sense that. Whereas years ago, I wasn't always able to make that connection. Now I can sense that. And there are times when I still do slip, but more
Mm.
often than not, I can say, okay, I slipped, right? I didn't eat nearly enough for lunch. Now, why did I do that? And who can I tell about that, right? Who can I
Mm.
share that with? And then how can I make sure that that doesn't derail my entire day? Because in the past, when I would slip, I would think, well, I'll figure it out next week or next month, or, when this busy stretch ends. And now I try to recognize that the longer I wait, the more likely that slip is going to turn into a slide. So I try to think about how can I get back up now, and then not let that ruin my dinner or anything along those lines. And so I really try to eat a variety of foods, although that still can be difficult for me. And I try not to have a restrictive mindset around food. So I never say that any foods are forbidden. I try to make sure that if there's a food that's been triggering for me in the past, then I may not keep that in the house, for instance. But otherwise, I really, especially as a mom who doesn't want to pass this disorder on to my kids, I really try to be cognizant about not demonizing food and about just taking this approach that all foods fit and that it is okay for us to eat the foods that we want, but within that comes choices around what foods are going to make us feel good in our bodies.
Right. The meaning behind slip, is it because it's that middle area, right? Tell our audience.
Yeah, so the middle place is really this name I've given to that liminal space between acute sickness and full recovery. It's a space where slips happen, but progress is always possible. And in many cases, folks with eating disorders tend to feel stigmatized whenever they slip, because when we talk about treatment for eating disorders, there's an understanding that slips might happen, but usually they're framed as something that is really in the early stages of recovery. And so many of us with eating disorders have been told that slips happen, but only early on. And if you're still slipping years into your recovery, there's something wrong with you. and and
Yeah.
that really just is detrimental. It's quite harmful when we take that approach, because then it forces people to think that it's not okay to slip. And as a result, many people feel shame associated with slips, and then they stay silent about them. And we know that silence and secrets keep us stuck, they keep us sick. And so, part of what I want to do in this place, in this middle place, is really normalize slips as being a part of the ongoing recovery process, and to recognize that that very word slip suggests some sort of movement. And rather than demonizing slips or fixating on all the things we've done wrong, it's also important to recognize the moments when we try to get back up because we can't slip if we're standing still, right? And so very often it's when we're making hard choices and trying to move forward that we inevitably end up slipping. And that's okay. The trick is making sure that you don't see that as grounds for sliding back into really scary territory.
You mentioned something earlier. You said, "Who can I call?" Like if you felt yourself slipping, who can I call? That's very obviously that's what they do, and what AA. It's what they do in Overeaters Anonymous. That's a very important component to this, isn't it? To having somebody to call. Do you still have somebody to call?
I do. So I actually started to go back to therapy when I began writing my book. And so
Hmm.
I still do see a therapist and a dietitian. And that's been really important for me just to be able to have ongoing maintenance and to have folks who I can talk to when I've had slips. Sometimes I'll text my therapist, and other times I'll just talk with her during sessions. But it's been really helpful to have folks who can hold me accountable in some ways, but who can also be sounding boards and who can listen not from a place of shame or blame, but from a place of genuine curiosity. Why do you think you
Right.
had that slip? Or where do you think that was coming from? How did you try to get back up again? And I also am lucky to have a really great spouse. So I talk to my husband quite a bit, and I try to involve him in these slips, even though that's really hard, right? For many of us, it's much easier said than done to talk about slips, but I've really had to learn how to be honest with him about those, because that honesty in many ways has strengthened our relationship.
Now you have two young children. I'm sure you're very cognizant of, making sure that, hopefully something like this wouldn't happen to them, right? Because what's that like for you as you look at them, as you're raising them, knowing what you went through as a young person?
It's something I think about multiple times a day. it's
Oh, wow.
it does weigh on me, especially as my kids approach the age that I was when I developed an eating disorder. And in writing my book, I talked with a lot of geneticists and looked at the research that shows that females who have a relative with anorexia nervosa are 11 times more likely to develop the disorder themselves. And so we know there
Wow.
is a genetic risk, but we also know that we don't inherit eating disorders. We inherit a vulnerability to them. And while there can be genetic risk, there is also environmental risk, and there are also genetic protective factors and environmental protective factors. So I try to focus a lot on those environmental protective factors in terms of thinking about how can I create a safe environment for my children. So I never use language around good or bad foods. So I don't want them to grow up thinking that they can't eat a certain food, or that they are bad if they eat what's been deemed a bad food. I try to let them think about how food is fuel, and try to help them see them for kind of who they are outside of the way that they look. So for my daughter's ninth birthday, I made her a mirror, which is in the shape of a flower. And on each petal,
Mm.
I painted a word that describes who she is. So creative, empathetic, kind, because I want her to look in the mirror and see who she is and not just what she looks like. And so sometimes for me as a mom, that can feel like fake it till you make it, in the sense that I have plenty of bad body image days. Often it happens throughout the day where I'm feeling bad about myself, but I don't ever let my kids in on that. I don't criticize myself when I'm looking at photos of myself, and I don't put myself down in front of them, because I don't want them growing up to hear that. I also don't expect them to grow up to unconditionally love their bodies, because that is really difficult in a society that's steeped in fat phobia and diet culture. But I try to help them to see that their bodies are not an ornament, but an instrument that helps carry them through their day. And by fueling their bodies with food, they can learn to take up space in this world. They can run, they can play, they can have the energy to do what they want. So I try to really share these messages and help them to learn that all bodies are worthy of respect. And I always say all bodies are worthy of respect, no matter how short or tall, big or small, because I don't want them to grow up thinking that people in larger bodies are bad, or that they've made bad choices. And so all of this is very much eating disorder prevention speak, but it is
Yeah.
also about really trying to just protect my children from ever developing this disorder that has taken over, so much of my life, particularly in my younger years.
Is it perhaps one of the most difficult disorders? And by that, I mean food, because many people overindulge and overeat. Many people are binge eaters. Many people are anorexic. I mean, the entire scope of having a disorder based around food. Is that one of the most difficult ones to treat? Because we have to eat, right? You don't necessarily have to drink, although I know that's equally as difficult. I'm not saying one is bigger than the other, but we have to eat. Would you say that it's perhaps one of the most prevalent disorders in our society?
So I think it's more prevalent than the statistics would suggest. So statistics show that 30 million Americans will have an eating disorder at some point in their lifetime. And yet we know that only about 30% of folks actually seek treatment. So there are many
Mm,
people who are struggling silently. And many folks who may be struggling with disordered eating and may not meet all the diagnostic criteria for a full-fledged eating disorder, but are still struggling. And to your point, I mean, whereas you can abstain from alcohol or drugs, you can't abstain from food if you want to survive. And so every single day, we're confronted with dozens, if not hundreds, of choices around food. So that really complicates things for individuals with eating disorders and with disordered eating because it's always there, right? So much of our social life revolves around
yeah,
food. And there are so many decisions that we have to make and so many societal pressures that tell us that we should eat this thing and not that thing. And just all of these different messages that we're getting that can feel really paralyzing for folks in eating disorder recovery, but also for individuals in general, right? There's just a lot at play right now. And they do really complicate all these messages, complicate that recovery process and can make it really difficult to fully recover because it's hard to
yeah,
fully recover in a society where there is just so much diet culture and there is
oh
what's
yeah,
called normative discontent, which is like this fancy term that researchers have come up with to show that the vast majority of people in our society have some level of discontent with their bodies. So to think we're never going to have a bad body image day or a bad food day, so to speak, is almost unrealistic in our society. And that's why I think the middle place framework feels more accessible
right.
because it allows for some slip ups, it allows for grace when we do slip, because this is a hard society to recover into. And quite frankly, it's a hard society to live in when it comes to food and body image.
And congratulations that, even with all of this in and out of, rehab, and you managed to study to become a professor in journalism. That's really remarkable. Do you share with your students your struggle that you've been through? Have they read the book?
So I do share with my students what I've been through because that's really important to me in terms of helping college students. We know that just
Yeah.
college age coincides with the average age of onset for eating disorders. So there have been students who have come up to me to say, I really appreciated hearing your story. One student in particular said, "You saved me," because she said,
Wow.
in hearing your story, I then realized that I had a problem and I decided to seek
Wow.
treatment. I know it just gave me the chills as I said it because there's this real power in sharing our stories and our vulnerabilities. And journalists are not often taught to share their personal stories. We always leave the I out of the stories. But for me, it's really been important to think about how do I use my tools as a journalist to do reporting, but then also blend that with my own personal narrative. And I love teaching students how they can do the same and showing them how the power of storytelling can actually help people to feel seen and heard and connected. So for me, that's been a really beautiful way of connecting with my students and also teaching them about the power of journalism and storytelling.
Anything else you'd like to tell our audience if they want to reach out to you, how to get the book? Any other little nugget that you want to share with them?
Yeah, so I always just like to say it's super helpful to think in terms of more recovery. So rather than thinking about full recovery, I think about how can I aim for more recovery in the middle place? Because I think more recovery day by day can lead to a fuller expression of it. And I would encourage just any viewers, listeners to really try to be honest about the middle place if that's where you find yourself, because we as a society tend to prefer narratives with protagonists who prevail and overcome their disorders. And in some ways, it's an act of courage to say, I'm not there yet. I'm in this middle place. I'm figuring it out. I'm navigating it. And by telling our stories, we open up invitations to help other people do the same. So I hope that slip will be a kind of welcoming friend and companion for those of us in the middle place. And it's available wherever you buy books. So I hope that folks will check it out.
Absolutely. I want to thank you so much for coming on to our show. The book is a terrific read. And again, it's not just for folks who might have or family members who might have an eating disorder. This applies to a myriad of all kinds of issues that we face in life and how we might be able to get through it and that we can get through it. With all the slips, we can get through it. So I appreciate your honesty. I really do. And gosh, uh, Mallary Tenore Tarpley, Slip, Life in the Middle of Eating Disorder Recovery. Please pick up the book. It's really a powerful book. If anyone you know would really benefit from it, if you benefit from it. I don't have the type of eating disorder that Mallary does, but as I read this book, I saw all sorts of people that I knew who had, different types of disorders, and I could see how they could benefit. This is just a terrific book. So thank you very much for writing it. And thank you for sharing your story. It's really a very powerful story, and all the best to you.
Thanks so much, Deborah. I appreciate it.
Yeah. And you could find my interview with Mallary on all video and all audio podcast platforms of Deborah Kobylt Live. So please just look us up. And if you have anything or any questions for Mallary, reach out to her on her social media pages. You can reach out to me once we have all of our promos out on our show, because this is really an important discussion. And if you feel like you need help, please seek it. Is there any number that you give to people? Is there any place you would say they should call? Is there a hotline? Or is there something that you'd like to say?
Sure. So the National Alliance for Eating Disorders, they're a wonderful organization and they do have a support line. They have a lot of really helpful support groups as well. So I just want to echo that if people are struggling, that is a wonderful resource. And the sooner you can get help, the better.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for adding that. So again, my name is Deborah Zara Kobylt, and please look us up. Deborah Kobylt Live is our program. Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.